is, but our hippocampus has only a certain number of slots. We know that kids with chronic stress and trauma have fewer slots, which means I can't memorize as well, and I can't go through as many steps. So this might be why you get the thing like, what page are we supposed to be on? What am I supposed to be doing? Ask questions over and over because they might not be hearing them, and they also might not be holding on to the information. It's why predictability is so important, and we can talk about predictability in the future. It's also why we want to illuminate kids' successes, because we want, if that hippocampus is where positive things are held, we want it to happen and we remember it, because when we remember things, they're more present in our awareness, which is so important for these kids. We also know that the prefrontal cortex, that executive functioning part of our brain that's responsible for task initiation, task persistence, moral judgment, time management, physical stuff management, all that is not as wired in yet. But it's also compromised by the presence of cortisol. Cortisol prevents cell growth in these two parts of the brain. And so when we have high levels of cortisol, so if I'm a stressed out kid, I need people to help support me to burn that stress off, that stress chemical off, because otherwise it's going to live in my brain and it's going to prevent my cells from being healthy. And so we want to get rid of it. And that's a real important thing when we think strategically how to deal with kids that are escalated. We want to make sure they can work through it. One specific part of our brain is highly related to lying. So let me explain. So anybody ever had a kid lie to them? The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is responsible for sequence and time understanding. How many people have had kids not turn in assignments? Okay, this part of the brain has everything to do with lying and not turning in assignments, or a big part of it. Now, I'm not going to be naive. There are some kids that are not turning in assignments not because of this brain reason, but there are some kids that aren't turning in assignments because of this, so I'll explain that in a sec. There are also some kids that are lying on purpose, and there's some kids that are lying because how trauma has affected how their brain is constructed. So, let me address both of those. With the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that is our sequence part of the brain. Memory, and this part of the brain goes offline. Your memory is more like a firework than a sequential memory. So you remember things in scattered ways. This is why when there's been a car accident and there are lots of witnesses, you ask everyone. And it's not just about their perspective where they were standing, it is because their brain has then gone into firework memory. And so they try to construct it for the person interviewing them, and they're pulling pieces together, but they are not sequential pieces. They're just all over the place, and they're trying to put it in a sequence. But they may or may not be very successful at it. This is what happens for some kids when they lie. Is we ask them something, what happened in the hallway, what happened to the lockers, and they start to tell the story. And they're pulling not from something that's ordered, but rather here and here and here, and they're constructing it into a story. And they're reading on our faces how successful that story seems to be doing. And if they're reading it's not doing so well, they may go grab another piece and change their story. Even if it thinks it's going real well, we get those embellishment moments suddenly, where they remember all kinds of extra details. It's because they're like, ooh, they like my story, and they go back and grab a few more. But they're not remembering in a sequential way, so it looks like their story's changing, but they literally can't remember it. So some kids lie because they can't remember accurately. They're doing the best job. And we've been experiencing the past couple of years, most of us have found that time has felt warpy. Anybody experience like, yeah, it's like, when did that happen? 2 weeks ago or 2 days ago? I'm not sure. Because our prefrontal cortex has gone offline with the stressors of COVID. So, I've stopped asking kids to tell me anything in sequence. If I know it, it's not a trick question, I just tell them what I know. Or I say, what's the big thing and how are you going to fix it? How do we move forward from here? because we can usually remember a big thing, and then we don't get stuck in all those details. I realize that some of your jobs may require you to try to get as much of the story as possible, but be forewarned, it may not be accurate, and it's not necessarily intentionally inaccurate. The other side is the fact that time is not, if our time centers go off, we don't have a good sense of time. And so kids that have had a lot of stressors, kids with trauma, their time centers have gone off, so they don't have a good sense of time. Analog clocks are really important. Digital clocks do not give us a sense of time, do not give the brain a sense of time. The more we can use analog clocks with kids, the more the brain understands time. But here's the other thing. When they've done research on why kids don't turn in assignments, they fall into two broad categories usually. One is, I didn't think I would have enough time to do it, or they thought they had more than enough time, and they waited till 10 p.m. 10 p.m. to try to get it done. And sometimes they got it done, and sometimes they didn't. That's true for starting classroom assignments even. Because if you don't have a good sense of time, you either overestimate the time things take, or you underestimate. You tend to not hit on the middle ground. So the more we can frame things in terms of time, the better off we're going to be. So just even like, we're going to do this for 2 minutes, that kind of experience, we're going to work for 2 minutes. Or this assignment will take you 10 minutes. Stop working at 10 minutes and we'll see where we are. Starting to get kids to think in terms of time can be extremely valuable. Another part of the brain that goes offline that you might have been experiencing during COVID is your posterior cingulate, and this is the part of the brain that knows where your body is in space. I've heard so many people say during COVID, I couldn't get my feet underneath me. I felt lost. They literally have lost touch with their body because of the stressors, the stress chemicals in their body. So for kids with chronic trauma, they have spent quite a bit of their time not being in tune with their bodies. So this is what we see. We see kids who don't have to, well, yeah, they do have to. They slide down the hallways. They're touching everything in the hallways. They're across the surfaces of every table. They are leaning into other people. They move through the classroom having to touch everyone or everything. If you don't know where your body is in space, you try to ground yourself. It's not a conscious act, it's a subconscious act. And so it's very analogous to if you're a sighted person, putting a blindfold on, asking you to walk across the room, what will you do? You'll be touching things, right? If I had to go down the hallway, I'd be sliding down the hallway. If their brain does not perceive where they are in space, they're going to find ways to ground themselves. And the other side of that is they're going to find those ways which sometimes create social conflict, some create messes, but they're going to also not be able to focus on anything else until they feel grounded. So simple grounding activities can make a world of difference for these kids, because if we spend some time knowing where our body is in space, that can carry us through other times. So there are a lot of strategies related to that. In trauma, our brains are flooded with stress chemicals, not common chemicals. So we have lower levels of vasopressin and oxytocin. Oxytocin is also responsible for bonding, which is going to tie into the whole issue of trust. So we often will see kids engaging in settling activities that are age inappropriate, that might make them look different. Thinking of 16-year-olds that suck their thumb. And that's the only way their brain has learned to settle itself when they're feeling very, very stressed. I don't know if you've had any of those kiddos here, but I've seen plenty and experienced plenty that have done kind of age different sorts of things, because that's all they have. And our answer to that is we need to really help kids learn ways and explicitly teach them how to self-settle in ways that they can carry with them out into the world. And hopefully we'll get to talk about self-settling in the future. Neurologically, if you've had trauma as your brain was developing, your system is not as organized as other people's neurological system, which means you're unsettled, but it also means that your system's not fully tuned up. It doesn't mean you can't do things, but you might need more support. You might need some time. You might need to do things differently. So let me give you an example. If your system hasn't tuned all the way up, your fine neurons at the tips of your fingers, the things in your face, the fine senses and nerves in your face are not fully interconnected. So you're more likely to have food on your face and people don't know it. You're also more likely to be a really hard kisser. That's just a real aside. And you're also going to be someone who struggles with fine motor tasks like finding the right page. A lot of kids, when they start struggling with things like finding the right page or writing things, how many kids resist writing, those sorts of things start to emerge because their system isn't not as well developed. It's much like older people whose systems are tuned down. And so an older person who has food on their face or food in their teeth and don't feel it, or can't turn pages or can't button, we will see that play out for some kids who have trauma because their system isn't organized enough to be fully tuned up. But it also is highly dysregulated. And so this is why some of your kids, after they've gone to their lockers, after lunch, are just a mess. And so I worked with one middle school that there were, a lot of their kids were fairly fragile, but they had a group of kids that came in from lunch and just were holy terrors in the first class after lunch. And so one of the things they did is they created a regulation space and had those children then leave lunch a little early, which got them out of the hallways, which was also highly dysregulating, because there are a lot of things that can dysregulate us. They got them out of the hallways before the masses. They took them out of the social stressful situations, and then they got to go to regulation with an adult who they really valued, who worked through it with them, and the regulation activity were things that they got to make some choices, but they were patterned and repetitive and calming for the brain. And so they then went and we looked at the data, and we looked at, then those kids went to class, and we looked at behavioral data, the school's behavioral data, their SLIS data, and what happened was profound changes in the number of kids that struggled in that class after lunch. And those kids that had been the real frequent flyers had settled down and they asked for it. Like I remember one day the person that manned the room wasn't there, and they realized they were like seeking out other people going, we're gonna get together in the reset night, we can get to go. They actually called it the Pride, which is another name. They really wanted to go there because they knew that they were much more successful when they got to re-regulate. Because if we didn't, we had kids that were doing fight, flight, and we don't want to forget freeze. That some of those kids would just shut down. They'd go in class. They weren't necessarily acting out. They weren't leaving, but they weren't taking anything either. Because they were here, and their body was in a frozen state. And they were not processing anything. So they weren't learning as well. Okay. Psychological. Whew, I've got 4 minutes for this. Okay, hang on. When our psyche, how we see the world, both subconsciously and consciously, is impacted by trauma, the big thing is how we perceive trust. And we can break it into 3 people, three groups. Do we trust adults? And the answer is probably I have a very skeptical eye in terms of adults. This requires us to be the slide that I skipped over, which is, you're very good. I can tell from the stories and what people have told me, and I met with your administrators, you're so good at the relational thing. This requires us to be incredibly resilient when it comes to relationship building, because children, and a great book, if you ever want to read a fantastic book, it's called Kids Who Outwit Adults. Kids who, they are often the push me, pull you kind of kids. We're the kids that you finally make an inroad with and then they sabotage your relationship. They're kids that do a lot of often annoying things. They make bids for connection that are the things that really get on their nice nerves. So their perception of adults is they're not sure they trust us, so they push on us, they pull on us, and that's a developmental task anyway, but it's such exaggerated form for many of these kids. And we just have to endure. We have to endure by being who we are and what we bring to the table over and over and over again. And that's what makes a huge difference. There are also kids that don't trust their peers very much. They may rely on them, but they don't trust them. That's an important difference. And so in a traumatized brain, our peers, the world is a place of scarcity. There hasn't been enough good stuff for me to feel safe. So my peers are my competition. And so we often see transactional relationships. I'll do this for you, you do this for me. Not the genuine caring relationships that we know really are what carry us through. And so we will have to be careful to not build into kind of competition. So one of the things we want to think hard about is how can competition tends to pit kids against each other, and is it actually creating more transactionality in relationships among kids? And it also calls us to think about how do we not just nurture our relationship with students, but how we nurture relationships among students. So are we doing things like being really careful about how we maybe only use dyads instead of triads, for example, in grouping, because they're so much safer emotionally. And finally, these kids don't have a lot of trust in themselves. They often want to be the boss of themselves, but then the very next moment they can not want to do anything. They don't trust themselves at all to move forward. And that's an exhausting way to be. And so the self-centering centers of the brain are turned off. My dysregulation means I don't know who I am, I don't know how I can be successful. And so I have a real insecure sense of self. And if I have an insecure sense of self, which is our big developmental task as a kid anyway, what am I going to see? What am I going to trust? And that is ultimately I trust chaos. Because chaos can be predictable. I know that if I flip that desk, or if I walk out, or I put my head down, I know what's going to happen. I don't have to worry about whether I'm going to be successful at that academic task or not. If I sabotage a relationship, I do not have to worry about whether you're going to like me or not. I'm going to ensure that you don't like me, and that's okay, because now I know at least what's coming at me. Because predictability in chaos is their friend. They will often say, kids with this history will often say, I feel safe with chaos. And one of the things that I see educators do all the time is helping kids feel safe with success in relationships and success in learning. And then that becomes the default instead of defaulting to chaos. The ultimate chaos button is dropping out, cutting school. It is the preview of dropping out. And kids at middle school and high school will push that button. And then we keep on trying to pull them in, and that's what a lot of the dropout prevention programs try to do. It doesn't have to be dramatic things. In fact, it's better if it's not dramatic. And so I may repeat this when we're together another time, but Garfield High School, this will be my closing story. Garfield High School, East LA, kids with high poverty, high crime, high gang activity, had an incredible dropout rate, and they were required to change that dropout rate, or else they'd lose funding. And of course, they weren't given any funding to change that dropout rate. So the staff got together and they came up with an intervention that was relentlessly relational, but it was very simple. And what they did, they identified 125 kids most likely to drop out that year, or in the coming year. So it was the year before, they decided they were going to do the intervention all year. And the kids that were most at risk for dropping out in the following year based on attendance, behavior, grades, and age. Identified those kids, made a list of them, they all got together and they made sure that every one of those kids had someone who knew their name. And when that person saw them in the hallway, they would greet them with their name and say, good morning, Diane. They would do a greeting of some sort using that child's name. They asked the rest of the staff, including custodial, lunch, everybody, to do their best, level best, to always do this as they saw that kid. Just a nod, just what they call sustained silent looking, very thin, but it was a look. They actually made eye contact. They did this relentlessly for the year. The other thing with the person that said their name made 3 personal contacts during that year. The personal contacts could be something as simple as sending a birthday card, checking with the teacher and finding something that generated It did not have to be a big thing. It was just a very simple connection. They do that for the whole year. They came back the next year. They get into child count time towards the end of October, and they looked at the 125 kids and how many had come back to school, had not dropped out, was 123. 123 out of 125 were back. I don't know the story about how many of them stayed for graduation, but every day kids are with people like you, they're going to have a better chance in life. And so, as we think forward about trauma-informed practice, remember it is the little things you do every day, it's what brought you to the profession, that are going to make a difference. And then we can refine from there. We can add in from there, but that basis is everything. So, have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.